following is a two-part conversation with Dr. Robin Carhart-Harris, a world-renowned neuroscientist and psychologist specializing in the field of psychedelics and particularly psychedelic therapy to treat mental health disorders such as depression, anorexia, anxiety, PTSD, OCD, etc. We talk about all those things in the two parts of our conversation. The first part, we hone in on the political landscape of psychedelics and how they have culturally, politically, and historically evolved over time in the public eye. And Robin talks at length about past NIH failures in funding psychedelic therapy. And we discuss the role of big pharma and the failures of the current and past existing psychiatric establishment in treating mental health using reductionistic neurochemical explanations of lack of serotonin and prescribing SSRIs. We talk about how psychedelics are a unique departure from that reductionistic perspective. We talk about the interconnectedness of biology, psychology, and sociology, and how mental health should not be viewed in a vacuum as either purely psychological, biological, or neurological, or sociological, and how we must have a holistic approach to mental health. We also talk about the excitement and hopes for the new health administration in the United States with Jay Bhattacharya, former co-host of this podcast at the NIH, RFK Jr. at the HHS, and Marty McCary at the FDA. The second part of the conversation, we talk about Robin's particular unique work in brain imaging studies for psychedelic therapy. We talk about his entropic brain hypothesis, about how people in mental illness, such as addiction and depression, have a high level of orderliness to their toxic pathological mental patterns. Thoughts like, I'm unworthy, I don't deserve love, I can't find love in life, it's hard to make friends, I need this addiction to survive, etc., etc. We talk about how psychedelics can add entropy and shake up rigid thought patterns, such as the aforementioned ones that I just alluded to. And we go deep into his theories around the relaxed beliefs under psychedelics, how through the entropy, people often experience a relaxation of their rigid thought patterns and an ability to learn new ways of approaching self and world and others. We talk about the efficacy for depression and anorexia, the ability to change beliefs. And we talk about the therapeutic potential of psychedelics at great length. All around, it was a fascinating conversation about psychedelic therapy and its future in our society. We also talk about free will and determinism and how psychedelics seem to enhance free will and agency so that people can actually take more ownership of their life and make better decisions and be more responsible adults and contribute to society. We also talk about Robin's work on the default mode network, the known as the ego center of the brain, and how he's changed his opinions on that as he's done more studies on this, and how psychedelics relate to ego dissolution and dysregulation of the default mode network as opposed to lowered activity, which was the previous kind of consensus. So we talked at length about all those things. It was a fascinating conversation. I hope you enjoy it. But before we get there, a couple of notes here from our wonderful sponsors. First of all, Alchemy Elements, a wonderful adaptogenic mushroom blend featuring adaptogens, which are compounds known to increase resilience in the nervous system and respond to stress. Things like reishi, cordyceps mushrooms, lion's mane mushrooms, shilajit, and more. Everything is third-party lab tested in Alchemy Elements, and I felt the difference in more awakeness, alertness, and energy throughout the day. You can use the code ILLUSION at the checkout and you'll save 10% on a one-time order or 30% off your first subscription order, which comes with a beautiful ritual kit, a gold bottle, a gold spoon, and a gold handheld frother to mix it perfectly every time. I highly recommend using Alchemy Elements. Again, use code ILLUSION at checkout. We'll leave all that information below. Secondly, a word from our sponsor, Trinergy Health, founded by Dr. Aruna Tamala, who's been on the podcast multiple times. We'll be back for a wonderful reader Q&A. The reality is, as discussed in this podcast with Dr. Robin Carhart-Harris that mainstream psychiatry has failed us for many decades in providing real holistic solutions to mental health problems. Psychiatric meds are often neither safe nor effective, so we need to find new solutions. Trinergy Health offers a holistic model to treating mental health. Aruna has founded and pioneered this wonderful, holistic 6-month program for mind-body recovery and wellness, and it's based on her foundational framework of diet, trauma, and toxins, which we've talked about in previous podcasts with her. Dr. Aruna and her team help each client address their specific root causes to find vitality, health, and harmony. Using this approach, many clients have healed from so-called incurable mind-body issues that other doctors have failed to address. So I highly recommend it. You can schedule an intake appointment for free at the link below, or you can call at the number below. We'll leave that in the description. And you can use code RAV10 to get 10% discount on Dr. Aruna's holistic psychiatry program. I highly recommend it. I've talked to her at length about psychiatry, mental health, and the biopsychosocial model to treating mental health disorders. So I can't advocate for her work enough. I hope you consider working with her if you're struggling with any number of issues from depression, addiction, anxiety, anorexia, etc. So without further ado, I hope you enjoy this conversation, parts 1 and parts 2, with Dr. Robin Carhart-Harris. All right, enjoy. I'm very excited today to have Dr. Robin Carhart-Harris, who's a professor of neurology and psychiatry at the University of California, San Francisco. I've been following Robin's work for a few years now. Since graduating high school, I've been very interested in psychedelic therapy to treat mental health disorders like depression, anxiety, PTSD, end-of-life distress, things like that. And when reading things like Michael Pollan's book and other things, obviously psychedelics have become very popular over the last few years. And I think responsible, rational, scientific discussion of psychedelics is really important. Psychedelics themselves, obviously, the experience of psychedelics doesn't feel very, rational or objective. They're very often spiritual, mind-altering, profound experiences that sort of transcend rational sort of understanding of things. But in my opinion, they should be used in a very proper, medically supervised and scientific container. And it's important to understand the effects, the benefits, and safety concerns, risks, who should use them, who shouldn't use them, for which conditions they should be used. And so I came across Robin's work a few years ago and became very interested in what he was doing. And Robin, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but Robin, from what I understand, you were the first to do the modern brain imaging studies of psilocybin and LSD. You invented the entropic brain hypothesis, which we'll talk about, and you co-created the Rebus model, the relaxed beliefs under psychedelics model, and you've also led a number of trials, particularly psilocybin for depression. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yeah, it is.
Yeah, well, again, thanks for coming on. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me on, Rav.
Yeah.
Let's be here.
Yeah. I watched your conversation with Huberman in preparation for this. I finished that conversation. And particularly your conversation with Jordan Peterson is probably one of the most fascinating conversations on psychedelics that I've ever watched. I know I've messaged you about that before, but that was a really high quality conversation, because it really, and Peterson is good at this, going really deep into sort of the foundation of mystical experience, psychedelics, of what's happening in the brain, the subjective effects, behavior change in thought patterns. So that was a phenomenal conversation, after which I realized, like, all right, we need to have a conversation to follow up on some of what you guys talked about there.
Yeah, well, thanks for saying. Yeah, Jordan's a great talker, isn't he? Yeah, that was fun. Yeah, I just met Jordan again. We had dinner for, I think, the third time a couple months ago, and he was here in Vancouver, and I went to his show. And when we mentioned your work and Matt Johnson's work,
Just so interesting to have someone like that who, and we'll talk about this as it pertains to your research, like kind of pulling from different things, right? From psychology, mystical experience, religion, neuroscience. It's great to have someone like that to have a platform, which, you went on to talk about some of these interesting things across disciplines, right? I think when I think of Jordan, I think of the sort of multidisciplinary way of talking about psychedelics is fantastic, and it created for an excellent discussion.
Absolutely. I really enjoyed that. Yeah, he's got a very deep understanding of psychology, and I guess we share an interest in certain psychologists, Carl Jung, for example. So yeah, it was really nice to connect with him on that level.
Yeah. So, there's a number of things I want to talk about in this conversation. And I've talked to your assistant over email before, and I think for this conversation, I want to keep it a bit rudimentary and fundamental, and sort of not get too ahead, because not everyone in my audience has thought about psychedelics and psychology and neuroscience of psychedelics as much as I have. Certainly not as much as you have, unless we're counting people like Matt Johnson, who's in my audience. We've done podcasts together. But the majority of my audience is not psychedelic scientists and researchers. So I want to stick to some more fundamental areas and sort of ask some more basic questions as well, without getting super esoteric, and potentially we can have another conversation at some point going more sort of deeper into certain things, which Jordan and you very much did that. I think that conversation I've heard 2 or 3 times now, and it's just that level of depth is hard for most people to comprehend. So I think it's important to cover some foundational ground in this conversation, because a lot of people understanding the neuroscience of psychedelics is very complex, and for a lot of people very hard to kind of wrap their head around. So I think it's important to cover some basic ground.
Happy to do that.
So your brain imaging research, that's sort of foundational to your work and what you're most known for. Although now that I'm thinking, let's just maybe back up for a second, and just for a couple minutes, let's just sort of keep it a bit topical and talk about your thoughts on where things are headed in terms of policy. A lot of interesting, exciting things bubbling up. Do you have any cursory thoughts on where things are headed in terms of approval and regulation of psychedelics? You have the FDA commissioner, Marty Makary, who's been on this podcast before, who's talked about psychedelics being a high priority for the FDA. You have RFK Jr., the secretary of HHS, who's signaled several times that psychedelics are a priority for him. Jay Bhattacharya, who's a former co-host of this podcast. We launched this podcast a couple years ago in 2023. He hasn't talked about this publicly, but a couple times during the podcast, when I've interviewed people in the psychedelics lane, he's expressed an openness and an interest to explore this area, which he obviously doesn't have personal experience with as an epidemiologist, but just this general interest that you see among a lot of people in the health agencies now, the commissioners and leaders and secretaries and a lot of advisors and people that I've talked to behind the scenes. Callie Means, special advisor to RFK Jr. Casey Means, now the nominee for the Surgeon General. Both Callie and Casey, who I've talked to before, have talked about psychedelics being such an important part of their of them coming up with this "Make America Healthy Again" vision. Callie credits having this one particular pivotal psilocybin trip after the passing of their mother a couple years ago, helping them process the grief of that tragic experience in the family, and then having this vision to unite people across political barriers under this mission for making America healthy again. So do you have any thoughts on where we're headed politically? Are you excited? Are you interested? Or are you hopeful in what's happening or otherwise? Tell me.
Yeah, thanks for asking, Rob. Well, quietly hopeful, and what a beautiful vision, isn't it? That in such a divided world to come together on health. Hard to argue against that. We've in the psychedelic research that we've done over the years, we've looked at a few different things. We even looked at political perspective and how psychedelic use might shift it in different directions. But one thing that we've seen that has replicated quite well is improvements in appreciation of nature connectedness, and improvements in well-being. So topics like that, I tend to think, cut through the political divide in an interesting way. So I love that vision of Callie's. I heard Callie on stage at a wellness event. This was the first time actually I'd ever heard of Callie Means, and he absolutely blew the room away with his just shooting from the hip approach, quite sort of establishment challenging. He was on stage with someone, I would say, from, in a sense, the deep establishment, big pharma, you might say, and he seemed to be speaking truth in a very powerful way. It was quite a thing to behold. Then I looked the guy up and I see that on his social media profile, he has our famous circles in his background of the action of psilocybin on brain functional connectivity. And I was like, who is this guy? I dropped him a little message and he responded, and that was really nice. So, yeah, I love that vision. And, to come together for the sake of health is really a beautiful thing. You might then go, okay, so what's the devil in the details there? But I would say more generally to your question, I feel quietly optimistic, wherever you are on what's happening at the moment in these interesting times, to think that there may be more openness to the evidence in support of psychedelic therapy has to be a good thing. Obviously, I've been in this area for a while. I'm a scientist. Ultimately, that's what drives me. I describe myself as an inquirer. That sounds kind of funny. I ask questions. I don't drive an agenda. So I ask questions about how psychedelics could be harmful as well as helpful. And that's what a scientist does, in an ideal world, we just ask questions, interesting and sometimes difficult questions. So, but I've asked those questions about whether psychedelic therapy could be useful, and the answers that I've been seeing, as so many others have, is that yes, they could indeed be very helpful. And so I am quietly optimistic, hearing some of the noises and seeing some of the people that are coming into power, that they might be more supportive than what we've seen in the past. And I would say that I've heard noises from positions of power for a while. NIH, for example, maybe not under the current leadership, but I've heard those noises and it didn't come through. It didn't come through. It was a lot of bluster. Oh, we're interested in psychedelics. Well, I didn't really see any evidence of that, to be honest. And neither did many of my really, I would say, very accomplished scientist colleagues in this field. It hasn't actually materialized. I think that's one of the great shames of this so-called psychedelic renaissance, that it has been floated and really birthed by philanthropic support, but not by the mainstream. It's happened despite the mainstream. And I would love to see that change, and there'd be broader and real, mainstream funding for this kind of research.
Yeah. I mean, it's such a shame that this research was halted for a long time and was stigmatized for so long. And our mutual friend Matt Johnson, who's done the incredible psilocybin work at Johns Hopkins for depression and end of life distress and for addiction. He's going to come back on the podcast soon, and we're all going to be meeting at the MAPS conference next week, which should be a lot of fun. Matt and I've had a lot of interesting conversations about psychedelics and how it intersects with politics and the public discourse. And really, there's no easy way at bottom how you could categorize psychedelics as left or right, or liberal versus conservative. It's been stigmatized as sort of far left in the past, hippie culture, anti-war. people who just want to tune out of society, drop out, not participate in society, not contribute to society. But it's and there's an element of if you want to look at liberal versus conservative or order versus disorder, you want to talk about liberal being sort of adding more chaos or kind of opening things up, conservative being about sort of conserving tradition, having more structure, more solidity. Psychedelics in the sessions, and we're going to talk about some of your neuroscience theories on this, the entropic brain hypothesis. But psychedelics definitely add an element of chaos, and they really shake things up. And we'll talk about what are the risks of that, what are the benefits of that, what is the utility of that. But they add this kind of chaos. But really, as Matt and I have talked about privately, I don't think we've talked about this publicly yet, but really it's helping. And I've experienced this subjectively. By the way, I've done particularly MDMA therapy. I've done 3 sessions over the past few years, sort of kind of once a year roughly. And I've had one LSD trip also in a therapeutic setting. So I'm based in Vancouver here. And so there's some accessible underground pathways to do this in a safe controlled setting, which I advocate for instead of a recreational setting, which I've never done and don't advocate for particularly. But really psychedelics, I see, as Matt and I have discussed, as helping people take greater responsibility and ownership for themselves and things that have happened to them, because we are products of our environment. And on some level, we are victims of trauma, of certain negative things that we might have picked up on in childhood from parents, from the way we were conditioned by our culture, by our school. Many people have been bullied or have been just ordinary human experiences where they've been let down. They haven't been loved enough. They haven't been understood. They haven't been validated. They haven't felt secure. They've had the irrational fears and worries and concerns. And that has an impact on our behavior. And that colors our reality and can lead to things like depression, OCD, PTSD. And so I really see psychedelics as tools to help people take more ownership and responsibility for their life. And that's, that sort of speaks to sort of the side of the political spectrum that is historically pushed back on a lot of this stuff. We're talking about conservatives, Republicans, right? Psychedelics should not be viewed, in my opinion, when done right, as just chaos agents, as they're shaking things up and leading people to just tune out of society and sort of escape society, escape reality, and just be in their head in this sort of faraway land where they're not taking responsibility. It's really the other way around when done properly, because you're taking ownership of pieces within yourself, of trauma, of brokenness, difficult things that you experienced. And when you're reprocessing them, and we'll talk about how that works and what you found in the laboratory, it allows people to exercise more agency, to live the life that they want, to be more free, to be more loving and compassionate and caring, to take care of their kids more, take care of themselves more, contribute to society more in some civic, enhancing civic responsibility, things like that. So I really think that discourse is changing now, and we're moving away from what I described as the more caricature, negative, far left kind of view of psychedelics to more of this can really help people actually participate in society more and be more themselves and take more responsibility and take care of others and themselves even more.
Yeah, I mean, you're describing the ideal, and I tend to agree. I would say there's still a political compass when it comes to psychedelics. You have a anti-establishment, anarchic, anti-capitalist element. Maybe they raised their voices during the MAPS Lycos submission to the FDA,
right,
and played a role in influencing opinions there. You do have this interesting sort of, what could you call it, maybe alt-right element that's here. It's funny, I remember, I don't know if Jordan, he's probably said this on camera, but he said he likes to take Timothy Leary's turn on, tune in, and drop out, and change the drop out for grow up.
Yeah, he said that a lot. Yeah.
It's a nice one. And that's the value that you're speaking to here. It's okay, you might have chaos under the drug, but you have that chaos in a controlled environment, a very supportive environment where you're not going to hurt your body or other people. You're safe in that sense. You're not going to run out into traffic. You're not going to jump from a height. If you are having, dark thoughts or visions, there are supportive people with you to guide you through that. And yes, the ideal is you come out of that, and after the ecstasy, the laundry, as Jack Cornfield would say, after the chaos, the integration, the responsibility, the engagement in society. It's not an escape from society, but rather a desire to reconnect and to contribute. Rick Doblin would say these kind of things. Maybe Timothy Leary advocated for some kind of revolution, some kind of dropout from mainstream society, but for Rick, the ethos was to work with the system, to try and make a change within the system. And so you might say that these days there is a more mature approach to psychedelics. I think if it is mature, if it is bipartisan, if it can be allowed to be pluralistic without anyone trying to own it, anyone from a political position trying to own it and kind of co-opt or psychedelics, then we stand the best chance of making it work this time. There's nothing intrinsically, you might say, there's nothing intrinsically political to psychedelics. Maybe in the past, and Michael Pollan's played with this, that, psychedelics are fundamentally solvents, so they will dissolve structure. But the structure comes back,
Right, the new structure.
It does. Yeah, and you can have more like a renaissance than a revolution. You can go back to find good stuff. I mean, this is one of the values of conservatism is that you preserve good stuff. Yeah, you refine good stuff and value it.
And get rid of the bad stuff. That's the liberal spirit, right? And as it pertains to psychedelics, right? You want to see what the bad stuff is. If we're talking psychologically, trauma, negative thought patterns, right? Obsessive thought loops, things that we're struggling with. But you want to conserve the important things, and that plays out politically, that plays out psychologically, that plays out socially, right?
Yeah, to steelman conservatism, you want to preserve the stuff that works, and that's why it's tied with tradition and so on. And then to steelman the liberals, they want to progress and keep moving forwards and changing, happy to change things to find better. But these are just they can be valid at different times. Here's me speaking as a kind of centrist. You can pick from either, because sometimes there's a good argument to be progressive, and sometimes there's a good argument to preserve. And psychedelics shouldn't be co-opted, I think, for political agendas. That was done by Timothy Leary, and at the time, and history hasn't really looked favorably on his attempt, on his project. And of course, in a sense, it really didn't work out because it crashed the whole sort of, scientific and medical effort around psychedelics. Can't pin it all on Timothy Leary, but you can pin some of it on his kind of messaging. So I hope that we're a little more mature this time around, try and work with the system, be pluralistic, be diplomatic, be mature, be sophisticated, and not influenced by stigma, not influenced by overhyping, and not influenced by trashing because we are scared or want to continue telling the world that drugs are bad, and something really simplistic and
that's just ridiculous. Really,
isn't it? Can we not please grow up and get out of that nonsense?
And I mean, alcohol is widely available and celebrated and hopefully used responsibly by a lot of people, but also used irresponsibly by a lot of people, right?
Powerful tools are powerful, for good and bad. And, the classic one that Stan Groff would talk about would be the knife. In a surgeon's hand, it can save lives. Psychedelics can save lives. And sadly, in tragic situations with ill intent, a knife can kill, and psychedelics can kill too. Yeah. So, these are powerful tools, and so there's great responsibility on using them right.
Yeah, and the last thing on this political intersection with psychedelics, I'm going to be writing an article about this soon on my Substack about it's not clear, and as you alluded to, whether you could inherently label psychedelics as liberal or conservative. And you can make a case for either way, right? From a more maybe superficial level or surface level, it's progressive in the sense of we're like, say, regulating psychedelics, approving them, making them available. It's progress. It's something new, right? It's reforming the current psychiatric system, and I want to get your thoughts on that in a few minutes about conventional psychiatry. And so it's overhauling the current biomedical reductionistic psychiatric model, and you're entering to something very new, very revolutionary, very paradigm altering. And so in that way, it's progressive, and to the extent that drugs are associated with sort of progressivism or people on the left, I mean, that's sort of just cultural, because I mean, like my therapist, he's Brazilian, and he talks in Brazil, ayahuasca is widely used as part of a lot of cultural traditions. But Brazil, he talks about the many people he knows in Brazil who are using ayahuasca, the ayahuasca churches. Those people are very conservative, culturally, religiously, politically even. And so for them, they can't be categorized as politically progressive, yet ayahuasca, this very powerful psychedelic, that's the ayahuasca it's basically DMT for 7-8 hours. They're using psychedelics, but they're very politically conservative. And so and you can make the case the other way, right? If you want to talk about growing up, as you alluded to, the Jordan Peterson quote, which is fantastic. Growing up, and I really see psychedelics increasingly as sort of part of an important aspect of human maturation that a lot of people sort of miss out on. And this is sort of, Gabor Mate talks about, a lot of adults, the way they behave is like children, people in their 40s and 50s, whether it's temper tantrums or sort of looking for validation, wanting certain things, searching for love, searching for connection. It can often feel very childlike. It can feel like people haven't matured. And so in that way, and in other ways too, like if you want to talk about sort of restoring, sort of, if you want to go the sort of Petersonian way of talking, of sort of restoring, us being made in the image of God, archetypically speaking, of sort of returning to our more pure, more loving, more open, more connected sort of nature. If you want to go more philosophical or spiritual, psychedelics help us return to that state. We understand ourselves better, and we understand other people better. Like, I think one interesting positive side effect of using this myself, just subjectively speaking, is I have a lot more empathy, I would say, for other people going through hard times. And I would say I'm less judgmental, including people in life, say old friends, old companions who maybe there might have been more anger or judgmentalism towards them, and there's a bit more understanding. So it's like, these are very positive things that a lot of religions like Christianity emphasize, the importance of understanding and compassion towards other people. So yeah.
The Renaissance, there are many types of Renaissance, but Renaissance means rebirth. And, it appeals to themes of recovery and restoration. And so I do think it's good that we have that term, the psychedelic Renaissance, because it works. It's valid in my view. It's not a revolution. Revolutions can be quite, destructive. But I do think what can happen with psychedelics is something like a restoration of values that have been forgotten, maybe an awareness that was forgotten. Yeah, and it takes us back to, traditions and ancient philosophies, whether back to ancient Greece and ideas like Plato's idea of what would it be to exit the cave, where you had a kind of imprisoned quality of consciousness, only saw the shadows on the wall as being real. What would it be to be led out of that cave? It would be very jarring, but in a sense, you would be seeing reality as it really is. And so, yeah, I think there's something about recovering, like a revival in a sense of forgotten wisdom, know thyself, that can foster things like empathy. It can enable us to be less blind spotted, less blinkered in how we navigate through the world. This is the ideal, but these are the ideals and values that I think we can rediscover and that could serve us well, for reasons of health and living well more generally. One would love to think more peacefully as well.
Okay, I think this is all very fascinating, and I want to return to some of these things after we talk about some of your research findings, the sort of spiritual, religious, psychological, behavioral implications of psychedelics. But I want to be aware and mindful of my audience, and people who don't know a lot about this area are curious, maybe skeptical. I'm sure a lot of people are still skeptical, particularly older people who might not know a lot about this area but are curious and have an open mind to a degree. Can you just, before we talk about your particular research on the brain imaging, can you briefly share with us, me and the audience, what you think is so unique about psychedelics in the mental health space? What is it? What is all this hype about for people who are new to this? What is the utility? What is the power? What is the sort of seemingly revolutionary aspect of psychedelics that make it so promising for treating mental health disorders that people have been struggling with for years and decades, right? That's really, we're seeing a lot of interesting success. People who've been struggling with treatment-resistant depression, end-of-life distress and grief, addiction, smoking addiction, tobacco addiction, PTSD, people who've served in war, who are having flashbacks of war, but also other kinds of PTSD like sexual abuse, anxiety, fibromyalgia, OCD, obsessive thought patterns, fears, irrational, debilitating fears. Why are psychedelics so seemingly promising for the space? We can start there broadly, and then we'll focus on a few areas as it pertains to your research after.
Yeah. Well, there's a few ways in which psychedelic therapy is different to what we've had for the last 100 years or so in mainstream Western medicine, at least. You might think early 20th century mental health care and theory mostly dominated by psychological models, psychoanalytic models, people like Sigmund Freud, and then maybe the dominant approach would either be incarceration for people with psychotic illness, or psychotherapy for what Freud would call the neuroses, and that might cover depression, anxiety, and so on. Then post 1950s, 60s, funnily enough, the period of time when psychedelics came on the scene in the West in medicine, we have had the drug revolution, and over time that developed into, say, SSRIs for treating depression and a lot of other mental illnesses. But drugs were dominating. The biological model began to really dominate. People within medicine saw the biological approach as the more sophisticated approach, the more scientific approach. A lot of projection remains onto biology, that it's the harder science, the realer science, the thing to really trust. I would say that was an ethos of NIH, NIMH that's dominated things for many decades. I think there's a lot to it. but I think it's overshot. And say, part of the philosophy of NIH has been to go after biomarkers of illness, and think about symptoms as almost of secondary importance, and elevate these biomarkers as if they are the only thing. And I think that's quite a blind-spotted, quite a blinkered, quite a myopic approach of only looking at one side of the coin, if you want.
Yeah. Can you elaborate a bit more on that? Like which biomarkers? And here, are you also alluding to, say, the idea of depression being caused by the chemical imbalance, lack of serotonin?
Yeah, that's a classic one. Yeah. So, and then that gets co-opted by marketers who say, you're suffering from depression. It's likely you're suffering from a chemical imbalance. It's likely that your serotonin levels are too low.
And here's the fix.
Yeah, there you go. Here's the fix. We've got a drug for that, funnily enough.
That to me is so absurd. That framing is just so ridiculous. Like it's just so like reductionistic. You're like zooming into like one area, which may be technically true, but it's just divorced from a more holistic biopsychosocial understanding of how human beings operate. Human beings don't just operate on neurochemical imbalances or balances in our brain. We're integrated human beings in society, with other people, with nature, with the food that we eat, the experiences that we have, the way we operate in society, right?
Well, I couldn't agree more, Rav, but sadly the system hasn't agreed and has put all the weight and the importance and the gravity on biology, and has even treated subjective experience as something unscientific. I mean, when has subjective experience, what it's like to be in the world, not mattered? Think about law, for example, how something impacts someone. All of that comes down really to how it makes people feel, the impact of acts on people. Subjective experience is right at the core of what it is to be human. And so to try and write that out of mental health care is an absurdity. It's perverse in a sense. And yet that's been the dominant model for so long. What I advocate for is what you mentioned. I know it's a lot of words, but biopsychosocial is one way to put it. Holistic is another. Integrative is another.
Mind-body. I'd like to, people use that. Mind-body.
Yeah, embodied.
Roughly speaking,
Yeah, and I'd love to think that this is going to come back in to
NIH, particularly.
Yes, NIH, and
I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful Jay will steer the ship, and other people involved. I'm really hoping.
My fingers are crossed. Yeah, and about time. Characterizing mental illness as brain illness is myopic. Sure, there'll be abnormal dynamic activity, maybe even abnormal anatomy, but to divorce that from subjective experience is the absurd thing. Biopsychosocial still has bio in it. It's not saying that the biological doesn't matter. It's just saying let's not overlook the other essential elements too, the other side of the coin.
Yeah, and just to put a footnote on that briefly, Dr. Chris Palmar at Harvard? Yeah, he's done some interesting research, and he was also on Peterson's podcast talking about how he's seeing, and I don't know whether to be skeptical about it or believe all of it or what, but he's seen incredible results with prescribing the ketogenic diet as treatment for things like depression, psychosis, even schizophrenia, things like that. So there might be something there that we're still not understanding on the biological front fully in terms of diet, exercise, nutrition.
Possibly metabolic things, and sort of uplifting people's energy and energy reserves, not sedating them with too much gluten and so on. So I get that approach, but yes, let's not let that be the only way to look at things either. So it is an argument for a more comprehensive look at psychopathology, at mental illness, and that requires seeing the problem as real at multiple levels or in multiple domains, in the biological, in the psychological, and yes, at the systemic level as well in terms of societal contributions. And that therefore means that, do you meet a multi-level or multi-domain problem with a multi-level, multi-domain solution? And that brings us back to your original question, which is, why is psychedelic therapy different? And I would say, well, it works best when it's allowed to be that, a multi-level, multi-domain solution. You're treating someone not just with a drug working on their brain, but with a substance that's opening up their psyche. And I'll be bold to say that psyche means soul. It means the whole of the mind, not just what's ordinarily accessible to conscious awareness, but the whole of the psyche. And what psychedelics reveal to us, psychedelic means soul revealing or soul illuminating. It means that the psyche, the whole of the mind, is far deeper than we realize if we only look at ourselves or other people through the vantage of normal waking consciousness. You have to alter consciousness, really, to see how deep consciousness can be, or perhaps better put, how deep the psyche is. And that's one of the amazing things that causes people to say, that was the most meaningful experience of my life, or that was the strangest experience of my life, is because you just didn't know that. You were in the cave your whole life. You didn't know that there was all this bright and brilliant world out there, scary as hell, but, wondrous also. And so there lies, in a sense, the secret source of psychedelic therapy, is that, it's a biological action, but also a psychological one. It's opening up the psyche so that you can see more of it. And what we're seeing more and more now is that probably the most important component to the therapeutic action of psychedelic therapy is psychological insight, is the epistemic nature of the change or the transformation. I'll put it another way that's less jargonistic. You learn something that you didn't know before, and now you can't easily forget, like you're changed because of seeing this now. The Platonic analogy of the cave is a good one. If you're let out of the cave and you see how things were working, you can't forget that kind of thing. If you're brought back in and chained back to the wall, that experience of seeing the outside world will stay with you forever.
And I want to go into more of that, what you just said, but to back up for a second, I've thought a lot about psychology versus biology. It's really not versus. It's all interconnected, right? Psychology, sociology, biology, and we're complex creatures, and we need social interaction, we need love, we need connection, we need to do things, right? Music, art, nature, sports activities, religious activities, spiritual activities, and then psychology, which is very much interconnected with that, of what kind of thoughts we're repeating in our head, what kind of belief systems do we have, what perception of reality do we have, perception of self, perception of others, and what is our behavior, how do we treat other people. You get into ethics, which also ties to religion and philosophy, and you get into politics as well. And then you have biology, right? And you've been on Huberman's podcast. He's very much popularized a lot of protocols for optimizing our biology, right? Morning sunlight, potential cold plunge, sauna, exercise, how to optimize productivity. He's done a lot of great work on that. And there's this interesting, I wouldn't say debate or even tension, but just sort of like, if you had to pick one, which is not really how you should think about it, but if you had to pick one, just as an interesting thought experiment, what's more important, psychology, biology? It's not really obvious which one you would pick, and both are equally important. But psychedelics really hone in on the psychology aspect of it, which I think is becoming more and more popular, and I think it's really important. And on some level, psychology is the most rudimentary, depending on how you look at it. You can argue either way. You can argue biology is the most important thing because ultimately it matters how long you live. And so if you're eating junk food and you're eating highly processed foods and you're not getting up, maybe you could achieve some kind of Buddhist blissful state or some kind of transcendence where you could just sit on the couch all day and eat cheeseburgers and fries, and you could transcend suffering and sort of be in a more of a meditative, peaceful state. But that's not, no one thinks that's how you should live a meaningful, healthy life, right? Biology matters. What you put into your body matters. Sunlight, exercise, supplements, nutrition. But the psychology aspect, which psychedelics are really helping us, helping reinvigorate and really encouraging us to investigate more and more of our perception of reality. And really on some fundamental level, and psychedelics are doing this, but also meditation has done this, right? Which is, sort of come much earlier than psychedelics to some degree, although the psychedelics are very popular in the 60s, right? Then they kind of got halted down. Now they're back. But things like meditation, psychedelics, the global interconnectivity of the internet, right? Learning about Eastern philosophies like Buddhism, as far as that gets integrated into Western society, all of that is pushing for this further investigation of the psyche and of our perception of reality, and about investigating what is true on a very fundamental level, that all you really have as a matter of experience is your mind in every moment, right? Is your interface to the reality, your perception of this moment, right? And you can have a very anxious perception of this moment. You can have a very hopeless perception, right? I mean, just nailing it down to just the core experience of reality, right? You can wake up feeling incredibly hopeless and that you are unworthy, that love is hard to get, that satisfaction is hard to get, that life is hard, life is suffering, life is painful, life is filled with tragedy. You can wake up with that perception, or you could wake up with a perception of incredible gratitude of, oh my God, I get to live another day and I have these amazing people in my life, family members. I've an opportunity today to make this the most beautiful day of my life. I can go outside, walk in grass, or walk in the city, shake hands with someone, give a phone call to a friend, do some journaling, do some meditation, go have a nice workout, prioritize my health, right? It's like your thought patterns and your perception of reality is so important. And I think psychedelics are encouraging an investigation into of our very core experience of reality. And I can't think of anything more important. Again, obviously nutrition, health, all those things, they work together. So it's not a do this or do that, but this emphasis on psychology and of our experience, I think is one of the most important things that psychedelics, broadly speaking, culturally speaking, is emphasizing.
Yeah. Yes, I quite agree. Matter matters, but so does how you feel. And a colleague of mine, Pedro Mediano, said to me once, the brain is only as interesting as the mind. And I thought, oh, that's funny. And Pedro's very mechanistically minded, brilliant computationalist at Imperial College London, mathematically very skilled and experienced and biologically minded. Yet he said that the brain to him is only as interesting as the mind. It's an organ that comes alive intellectually because of how we know it maps to subjective experience. But the subjective experience is what, brings to life that organ and says, look at me, I'm important, So in that sense, you'd put the subjective experience first. I try and hold them like a Libra in balance, like a coin with two sides, because it's easy to fall into a trap of overweighting one side and then neglecting the importance of the other. Maybe you could smoke 5-MeO and 5-MeO DMT, very potent psychedelic, the Everest of psychedelics, Michael Pollan called it.
Yeah.
He smoked Sonoran desert toad secretion, and that contains 5-MeO. And have something like an enlightenment experience, some kind of satori experience, a communion with the one, pure consciousness,
experience of oneness, ego dissolution, non-duality.
And maybe the setting the context in such cases doesn't always matter that much, dare I say it, because it was such a sharp and rapid biological action and change. But it's still phenomenological. It's still subjective. And I'm not sure I could confidently say that drug and biological action alone is always going to give you great therapeutic outcomes. I tend to suspect, as many of my colleagues do, that the integration process that follows is critically important. And if you neglect that,
absolutely,
you might be neglecting some, let's say, psychological material that could cause a kind of problematic bypass that actually, rather than seeing more, you might inadvertently be missing some really critical stuff that could do with some, digesting. Maybe it's relational stuff, maybe it's stuff that's happened in your past that in going so quickly and rapidly to such a far extreme of pure consciousness, you kind of skipped over some stuff in the middle that really deserved some attention, some of the difficult processing and work that you might do in integration. What's integration? Well, psychotherapy is one aspect of the kind of integration that happens after psychedelic experiences. So, and that's, again, it sort of aligns with Jack Cornfield's wisdom that after the ecstasy, a bit of work, a bit of duty still, all in good time, but don't neglect that. Don't forget to show up. Don't forget to continue to be a good father. And so, after the ecstasy, the laundry was his sort of playful phrase. So, I'd say I hold both sides as equally important. The so-called idealists might go to an extreme and say subjective experience is the only thing that's real. I tend to think that that's quite a fundamentalist view. That's quite extreme. Doesn't feel compelling to me. It feels a bit contrived and forced. At the other extreme, the hard materialists might say it is only brain activity. Or that feeling of love, that's just billiard balls. Maybe Sam Harris and you might go in that direction.
Right. And then you get the anti-free will, you get the determinism.
And I just find all of that a bit nauseating. Sure, there's causation, but don't mistake the fact that things are caused with an absence of some ability to choose and decide and some, diversity of possibilities. So I think that's oversold as well. The whole there's no free will thing.
Well, can we dive into that a little bit more? I didn't actually plan on talking about that, but you know Bobby Azarian?
I do. I like Bobby a lot.
He's a good friend.
I love his book, The Romance of Reality.
Fantastic.
I'd happily plug that for him and for everyone else. It's a great read.
He's a very good friend of mine. And we tend to have long stretches of conversation over text and phone call about free will and agency. And we've been doing that for a while. And recently it's been coming up quite a bit. I do want to sort of build a foundational understanding of your work without sort of moving too far ahead. So maybe we'll fold agency and free will back into when we talk about the relaxed beliefs under psychedelics. I think that'll be a good tie-in for that.
Sure.
A couple other footnotes too about what we were saying earlier on the sort of political pragmatic front. Matt Johnston and I are talking a lot about psychedelics and what I just said, free will and agency. psychedelics as enhancers of agency. I was just
I like that.
I was just messaging Andrew Huberman about that a few days ago.
Yeah.
He just interviewed Jay Bhattacharya. I highly recommend that interview.
Oh, nice.
About the future
Yeah,
of
yeah.
NIH.
I saw that actually pop up, so that's good to watch for me. Yeah.
Yeah, it's excellent. I've only watched a bit of it. It's 4.5 hours, very long. But it's the bits I've seen so far are incredible. And I'll just say, Jay is. I have the utmost respect for Jay. Like, there's no scientist I respect more than Jay. That's why I collaborated with him, and we launched this podcast together. And he was a brave voice during the pandemic, and he's not afraid to take hits from different political perspectives. So, some people on the far left hate Jay, didn't like Jay for pushing back on lockdowns and school closures and vaccine mandates, and having an honest conversation about vaccine side effects in young people. Other people wanted to say that all vaccines are dangerous and part of some conspiratorial plan, and he doesn't do that either. So I'm very hopeful about where things are headed. And Matt and we penned the psychedelic policy reform agenda for the Trump administration in November. I don't know if you saw that, but we wrote a policy reform agenda, which got a good amount of traction. Joe Rogan ended up retweeting it. We heard some good things from Ivanka Trump. She liked what we were up to there. And I'd love to, I'm not obviously involved in anything concretely with the new administration, but I have a lot of good connections and I've talked to a lot of people involved. And I'd love to, facilitate any connection and conversation on this front. And me and Matt Johnson, we've had lots of great conversations amongst ourselves and in reaching out to various folks involved in the new administration. And to the extent that you'd want to participate in something, just at bare minimum, there should be some kind of moratorium or just formalized conversation of like, let's talk about this on a political level. Let's talk about this at the FDA, at the NIH, at HHS, at the VA. Let's have some further conversation and hopefully let's pave the way for policy as well. I would say this privately too, but just on the record, any way you want to further participate in that or spotlight your research or have more conversation on this front on a higher sort of legislative level, I'd love to facilitate that in any way that I can.
Okay, well, thank you. Do you know, Rab, I think I might have said this to you and Matt as well. I tend to do best when I remain independent and independent of politics. However, I do have a view on how things have happened and policy on psychedelics. So it can be to some extent maybe cowardice to retreat entirely from political discussions. So I would say in whatever way I can contribute my scientific and theoretical understanding of things, I'd love to contribute that. Yeah.
There should be some sort of public hearing, independent advisory panel. I mean, just yesterday, I was very happy to see RFK Jr. has a new CDC vaccine advisory panel, and they're fairly people from different institutions. Like a good friend of mine, Martin Kulldorff, formerly of Harvard, he's part of this advisory committee. So if initiatives like that can be formed on psychedelics, some kind of independent advisory committee or just public hearings, public conversations at NIH, FDA, people like yourself and Matt Johnson and others would be incredible to take part in something like that. Yeah. So
I'd love to see that. I do have a view, put it that way, and part of the view is that for a good while, systems haven't been working in mental health care and in research. There's been a kind of, I think, a soft corruption in a sense, a systemic problem in the way things have been done, say, in terms of NIH funding. I've realized that. I've experienced that. And so the system needs a shake-up, I believe.
Tell me more about that, actually. Let's linger on that for a minute. Yeah, tell me more. What are your thoughts on NIH?
Yeah, I mean, I have experienced proposing studies in human beings that could have answered really key questions about the action of psychedelic therapy for depression, for example, like, what's the role of a certain pharmacological mechanism, a certain receptor, serotonin receptor, and its involvement in the way that psilocybin may be able to treat depression and other disorders. And part of the reviews that I got back told me that we know from mouse work that that receptor isn't key to the action of psychedelics. And that's, flies in the face of what we know from human research. So we're lifting the mouse to a level above the human. It's like, I call it the Murian industrial complex.
That's so ridiculous.
It's like the mice have taken over NIH and are running the show, and it's
and just to be clear, you're referring to the serotonin 2A receptor, which has been known to be key in psychedelic
therapy. I proposed a study blocking it. I mean, it's not an original idea. Many colleagues have proposed this too, but I proposed doing it in people with depression. We treat them both, two groups with psilocybin. It's just one group, we block the 2A receptor. And they said, no, the mouse work says that that's not worth doing. It's like, what, really? I proposed another study to do 5-MeO, simultaneous EEG, fMRI. 5-MeO, the Everest of psychedelics. It's very, very potent. You have to be very careful with that.
Yeah.
So, but no one's ever done any fMRI work with that compound. A lot of people would love to. And I thought, yes, it's now on a development track towards potentially being a medicine like psilocybin. And so there's a good reason to look at it, not just blue sky research, but, medical development research. So I proposed doing a multimodal brain imaging study using both EEG to look at brain waves and fMRI to look inside the brain, to look at the action of 5-MeO. But because 5-MeO is so potent and you have to be careful and ethical in how you do this work, I said, let's do it in healthy individuals who have used 5-MeO before and in whom we know it's safe enough that they can have that drug in a scanner. So let's establish that they can have that drug and tolerate it well enough such that you can put them into a high intensity magnetic field where it's a very constrained space. And
so people have used the drug before?
Yeah, that's what I propose. And so the risk of them thrashing about, people on 5-MeO have been known to rip their clothes off and have orgasms, and I'm not exaggerating. It's quite well known that, however, there's a subset of people who can stay very still and appear very peaceful. They're playfully called the Buddhas or Buddha sitters. So we would identify such people, establish that they are what they claim to be, that we can give them 5-MeO and they stay still. And we would do that in the scanner. And so NIH get back to me and they say, do it in depression. And it wasn't just one person who said that. It was like 3 or 4 reviewers. And so they're saying, forget about 5-MeO experience, forget about healthies, jump straight into depression and do this in depression. And they give me a score that means that the grant won't get funded because this is how they see it. I mean, this is the problem, is that you...
But if it was for depression, so if it was for depression, then they would have approved it, potentially?
Well, then I thought, shall I do it in depression? But my ethics and integrity says I'm not going to put someone with depression, with suicidal thoughts, on 5-MeO for the first time in their life and throw them in an MR scanner. I'm not going to do that. Thank you very much. Who are these idiots on your review board saying such things? And this is what we're up against, right? Because there's such misunderstanding about psychedelics, people propose these things, or they only know it through the lens of mice that twitch their head a bit when they're on LSD. I mean, and that's their readout of a soul revealing drug. It's whether they twitch their head or not. I mean, come on. We just really need to improve the understanding of this area so that quality science can get supported.
So this is your view of the NIH, is that their reviewers
In
are
relation to psychedelics, and they made a lot of noises. Nora Volkoff of NIDA is saying, "I'm interested." Is she really? I haven't seen much money coming in for psychedelic therapy for addiction disorders. I think it's a lot of posturing and, this is trendy. I'll show that I'm not too conservative. But no, I don't think you're interested. I think you're posturing there.
Yeah, so she's been horrible. I just want to say that I've not been a fan of what she's done there at NIDA, the National Institute of Drug Abuse at the NIH. Nora Volkow, the director of that agency. There's not been a lot of innovation, nothing really creative or enterprising going on there.
Yeah, let's get real. You look at rates of illness and the opiate use disorder problem in America and elsewhere in the world, in Canada. Yeah. I mean, it is an absolute travesty, and treatments aren't good enough. They're woefully bad. And yet, the main funding bodies aren't brave enough. They're gutless. They're not brave enough to support this because of the reputational risk, or because they're getting people to review these grants that have spent their whole career looking at mice brains, or just really don't understand the area and probably have picked up a bunch of misinformation from the drugs war that psychedelics are bad.
And you're suggesting that NIDA should have funded more psychedelic therapy research
without
for
question.
addiction?
Say ibogaine as a treatment for opiate use disorder. Sure, right. Ibogaine carries some risks, but also some tremendous potential.
And psilocybin.
Maxwell, incredible response rates in treating smoking addiction. Such a big killer.
Yeah.
So many.
And alcohol addiction.
Alcohol addiction, how disruptive and socially and on a family level, how destructive that drug is. And yet, treatments that could have really saved lives, turned not just individual lives around, but families around. It's been denied. Yeah. It's really a travesty. So this is where we need to change things.
Yeah. My dream is to get Matt Johnson as the director of NIDA.
Let's see what happens.
I don't know if that's too quixotic of a dream or if that's practical, but I'll just leave it at that. Anything else you want to say on so this has been your experience with NIH, and I assume you're just giving a couple of examples, but are there many examples?
It's a long list, and it's not just in the States. I mean, the Wellcome Trust were just as bad. They didn't fund anything. The huge funding body, nothing towards psychedelics of any substance.
I want to focus on NIH because this is interesting now. But so your general take of NIH is that their reviewers, they're just naive, myopic. They don't understand psychedelics. They're uneducated. They're not bold. They're not ambitious. Is that kind of your? Yeah.
And there's a soft corruption. They'll help their buddies out. I mean, I heard this from a very established psychedelic scientist with papers in the top journals, Science, Nature, served on their review board, and she said that she just came in really straight and did it, rating the science as she saw it, wasn't invited back. She just said, the sense that she picked up is people help their buddies out. I mean, it's a soft corruption, and and I mean, what I've been saying sounds like I'm pooping on animal research. I wouldn't do that entirely. I do think it has some value to look at, biological mechanisms. We can back translate, so we can see things in humans like that a psychedelic induces a certain quality of brain activity. I call it the entropic brain effect. We see that very reliably, robustly with psychedelics. I am surprised that people don't look at that in mouse recordings where they can record with better precision, getting into the brain, and then see whether that effect relates to some of the stuff that they love showing in rodent work, like synaptogenesis. I'm really intrigued whether there's a dots to join there, so to speak. That's back translation, where you see something in humans that seems to matter. So we've seen that the bigger the entropic brain effect, the better people do in the longer term, the bigger the improvements in their well-being. And so it seems to matter in a human being. Human beings, I think, matter when we're thinking about mental health. I don't think that's a stretch. So why don't we now look back in the rodent where you can do more invasive work and see what that's relating to in terms of other aspects of the biology that you can't see so easily in a human being, because you're not, going to kill a human being, cut their head open and slice up their brain to see how, the dendrites have behaved after giving them a psychedelic. But you do that to rodents, whatever you think of animal research. So we could do back translation work like that. So many missed opportunities, I think, because Murine industrial complex has kind of co-opted the field. It's produced drugs like SSRIs and some benzos and some sleep drugs, and some people think that they're good and they've helped things along. They might have on some level. It's another tool for clinicians. But a lot of other drugs and medicines were found somewhat, by accident in a sense, or we had hunches because of what we're seeing in humans. With psychedelics, that's really largely what's happened. These are drugs, yes, but they've also been used in plant and fungi form for many, many generations. And so they have some kind of track record. They've gone through trial and error like other things, just not with the level of rigor that perhaps we do in Western scientific trials, but they've still gone through a process of trial and error, and you could argue a longer process too, much longer process.
Yeah. We still haven't talked about your research yet, but this is, I knew this would happen because there's so many things to talk about. But I do want to give, now I'm remembering an example. A good friend of mine, Joseph Freeman, is a senior advisor to Jay Bhattacharya at the NIH. I'm pretty sure I can say that. I'll double check after the recording just to make sure, but I'm like 95% sure I can say that at least. He's a senior advisor to Jay Bhattacharya. He was fantastic. He's an ER doctor from New Orleans, but he did a fantastic research reanalyzing Pfizer and Moderna's clinical trials, looking for serious adverse events associated with the mRNA vaccines, and wrote an excellent paper in the journal Vaccine. That's kind of what he's known for during the pandemic. And now he's with Jay as a senior advisor. I interviewed him on my podcast because I think we mentioned psychedelics in one of our private conversations during the pandemic. There was this whole band of scientists and researchers who kind of banded together during the pandemic, who were sort of relegated to Substack and podcasts because a lot of their, unfortunately, sort of contrarian views, they really shouldn't have been contrarian, but were deemed contrarian. So we all kind of banded together. Joseph Freeman was one of these people who's now a senior advisor to Jay. And we were talking about psychedelics one day, and he told me, and we did a long interview about it. And then I did an article on my Substack about his experience. I just pulled it up again to jog my memory. But he shared with me how he, I think he was an undergrad, might have been a grad student, but in either case, he was took part in a series of rat studies from 2005 to 2008. And his lab, I'm forgetting which university, but his laboratory where he was working, they found that adolescent rats were far more resistant to MDMA-induced neurotoxicity than adult rats. But that result contradicted the prevailing beliefs at the time about the adolescent brain being particularly vulnerable to MDMA neurotoxicity. But in their research, they were incentivized to downplay that finding due to pressure from their funder, the NIDA, National Institute of Drug Abuse, because they had a vested interest in portraying MDMA as being harmful, particularly to young people. And so that you can see the politics interfering with the scientific research and how you publish those results, how you articulate them. He also found in a 2008 study that a single dose of citalopram, an SSRI, which you've also worked with in various studies, it caused long-term serotonin system changes in rats. But his lab refused to further investigate that for fear of pharma industry potentially retaliating or cutting funding for their lab. And so that finding was buried in their final publication. And there's a few examples that he told me where how investigating psychedelic drugs like MDMA, there was far more scrutiny and incentive to exaggerate safety concerns, whereas for pharmaceutical drugs like SSRIs that have clear side effects like sexual dysfunction, there was far more incentive to promote and report on positive findings, whereas the positive findings related to MDMA had to be downplayed. Very clear incentive, and so now, and he's very open to this line of inquiry, and now he's a senior advisor to Jay, and so just a perfect example of what you're talking about, right?
Yeah. I mean, there was that famous George Ricorte study where they'd given methamphetamine to monkeys, and methamphetamine is a very toxic drug, highly addictive, and it damaged their brains. And they did some PET imaging and showed some of this damage. However, they reported the paper in Science as the effect of MDMA, and they hadn't given MDMA, they'd given methamphetamine. And so it's a classic, that work had to be retracted, which is always an embarrassing thing for a scientist when they discovered that actually they'd given the wrong drug. I mean, it's ridiculous.
Did we ever find out why that happened? Was that just a mistake? I wrote about this in my article, but I can't remembering if they found a cause.
Maybe get Rick Doblin on. He knows about that case very well, and he would have a view. I don't know. I don't know if it was innocent or whether there was...
I don't think we know what it was, but in either way, it led to the sensationalist...
Well, it did. It got on Oprah,
narrative,
and
on
she
MDMA.
said, look, ecstasy, ecstasy puts holes in your brain.
Yeah.
And then
government propaganda, government misinformation.
Yeah. And then, and then everyone's hearing this, and there's this whole moral panic about kids on MDMA, and those kids on MDMA are probably hugging each other and expressing deep love and enjoying, electronic dance music and having the time of their life. And that's actually the reality, not taking a much more toxic drug, alcohol. So, all these drugs have harms, and MDMA does too, but let's just get real about it. And these days, Oprah's now having Michael Pollan on, telling the world how amazing psychedelic therapy is. And I would say there may be a little bit of overhyping. That's what happens when things get dumbed down for mainstream media, is that you exaggerate. And so she was saying things like, people think you take psychedelics and jump out of... Well, sadly, these tragedies can happen. And if people are taking psychedelics... I was contacted by the mother of someone who died, a young man who died under the influence of magic mushrooms because he drank protein powder, for muscle recovery, and choked to death. And this happened on a decent dose of magic mushrooms because magic mushrooms impair judgment. Tragedies happen. People do fall or jump from heights. They go into water thinking they can swim underwater like a fish, and they can't. So, that level of judgment is impaired under classic psychedelics. It's why we emphasize set and setting. So, Oprah is saying, oh, that's just an urban myth. It's not entirely. And I was contacted by this mother saying, did you see your buddy Michael Pollan on Oprah? She shouldn't be saying this, and I felt for her, and so it's a case of going from extremes, either exaggerating harms in a way that doesn't reflect the evidence, or hyping things up that doesn't really reflect the harms in a responsible way.
Absolutely, it's people should drive with the driver's license. They should not be swimming if they don't know how to swim. And I know people who I know people who know people who've died from drowning in water because they don't know how to swim. Right? You have to do things in a proper, regulated, controlled fashion, not just.
You do. And people might think, oh, he's a boring scientist. He's just saying it because he wants to keep his job or whatever. But no, I truly believe it. I'm doing a big study at UCSF on set and setting. It's the biggest study I've ever tried to do. It's 120 people. Let's hope we can, raise all the money to do it all. But we're 11 people in of 120. and it's a study to look at psilocybin versus placebo, enriched, unenriched set and setting, whether drug exaggerates the influence of the set and setting. And if we find that it does, then any idea that psychedelic is just some drug alone therapeutic model, that it's safe enough to take a psychedelic without caring about set and setting, will be rightly qualified by the evidence, or we'll get surprised and find that our hypothesis that set and setting matters isn't the truth. That's why we do science. We open ourselves up to getting it wrong. I tend to hold that hypothesis quite strongly, as you can tell, that set and setting does matter. And maybe actually it matters most for safety. Even though people are tripping in our study in an unenriched set and setting, for example, there's no music in that condition. They're still in a clinical research unit just a few yards over to my left in a very, very safe space, watched by two people at all times. So we would never give a high dose of a psychedelic, which we do. We give 25 milligrams of psilocybin in any conditions where we felt we were jeopardizing safety. So ethically it's sound, and scientifically it's exciting whether we see that exaggerated influence of the controlled set and setting in this particular study.
And but before we get to your research, if we can ever get there, I know we will. But
we just did.
But I want to sort of go to kind of how you started and kind of track that journey and the brain imaging work. But this is a really important point, and we should make it here while we brought this up about psychedelic sensationalism. And I really I see this coming up a lot in mainstream media, in newspaper articles, podcasts, with this idea that psychedelics cure depression, PTSD, anxiety. And it's this implicit idea of psychedelics being a pharmacological intervention, as in you take, just like there's SSRIs, which have questionable efficacy, you take, say, psilocybin, or you take MDMA, and then, most people know you have an intense experience, but some people may not even know that. But it's like this idea of you take the drug, and then after you take the drug, your depression is gone or strongly alleviated, or your PTSD is gone or strongly alleviated, or whatever mental health disorder. And so it's you're taking this pill, you're taking this capsule, whether it's psilocybin, MDMA, DMT, whatever it is, and then it fixes something in the brain, and then you no longer have that condition, or you have a more alleviated version of that condition. And that's not really how it works. I mean, there is something to explore on the biological side and the neurological side, which you're exploring with your brain imaging work. But it's that's not really how it works. It's much more holistic. It's you go into the experience, and it can be painful at times. It can be quite profound and beautiful at times. And that experience helps elicit and facilitate deep, profound revelations and insights about the way you're living life, the way you're operating mentally and psychologically, how you're treating yourself, how you're treating other people, your past, how your past influences your present moment and the future, potential trauma or just adverse experiences you may have had going back to childhood, how that shapes your personality and how you therefore treat other people, and how your perceptions of reality are colored by past negative experiences and things like that. And then you come out of the experience, you might be feeling really good, you might be feeling exhausted, or you might just be feeling really drained. And for some people, you kind of open up a lot of things, and it might be difficult after the experience. But then is the integration. And in all the studies, which sort of psychedelic naive people might miss, is that it's psychedelic assisted therapy. It's not just take the psychedelic and then that takes away your depression like some kind of magic pill. It's you have the long session with a therapist or two, and then is the integration the day after, the week after, and then there's this continued work for weeks or for months where you're integrating the lessons that you learned in psychotherapy. So it's not in an isolated container. It's a continued integration of those lessons and insights. And if you don't integrate those lessons and insights in ordinary talk therapy, then you may go back into ordinary patterns of behavior and of thinking, and then it may not have the effects that you thought, because you're no longer practicing this new way of thinking or new way of relating to your trauma or your past or your future or your relationship to self or others. And so I feel like a lot of that nuance gets missed, and people think psychedelics are just magic pills that take away your suffering. And it's understandable, right? People who are rightly frustrated with how psychiatry has utterly failed in providing real holistic solutions to mental health. People might think, oh, here's the magic mushroom that I'll take. Here's the DMT dose or the MDMA that I'll take. That'll just alleviate my suffering. It'll liberate me. I mean, that's the origins of a lot of religions and contemplative traditions, right? Let's find whatever meditative practice or prayer practice or religious text that unlocks the key to liberation from suffering. But psychedelics are not magic pills. They're not pharmacological interventions. They're deeply holistic tools that help facilitate deep inner insight into how you can improve your life. And then you have to actually integrate it after the session. So it's not just the experience, it's the experience plus the daily, weekly, monthly integration through mental rehearsal, practice, further. Like oftentimes, and I can attest to this from subjective experience, sometimes a month later, 2 months later, even I would say 10 months later, like I had an MDMA trip last January, like even earlier this year, 12, 14 months later, I unlocked some insights that weren't obvious in the first 12 months after the experience. So it's like, sometimes you're unlocking things and learning things even a year or years after that experience that help improve your life.
Yeah. Oh, well, I couldn't agree more. Elixirs and philosopher's stone, they're seductive myths, but they're myths. And psychedelic therapy, I'm agnostic as to what's more influential. So I quite like psychedelic therapy. Some people, they go with psychedelic assisted therapy. I'm good with that too. I tend to agree with what you were sharing, that it is maybe most fundamentally psychotherapeutic, the action. It is a thing of psychotherapy. The drug is a facilitator of that thing that is essentially psychotherapeutic. So things like the relational component of psychotherapy, that you like and trust the people that are with you during the trip, but also afterwards, is critically important, that there's good rapport there. And this isn't just theory talking, this is some evidence as well. Expectations could play a role, although the evidence doesn't back it that much, that positive expectations are driving response. A few critics of psychedelic therapy have come in and said it's all snake oil. It's all you believers, you true believers, that your belief transferring onto these patients, and that's what's getting them better. But the evidence hasn't supported it so far across a number of trials: depression, anorexia, I think Parkinson's as well, that pre-trial expectations haven't predicted actual response. So usually expectations plays a role in response to psychotherapy, but with psychedelic therapy, it suggests that there's something more substantive to its therapeutic action than a mere snake oil.
And just to clarify, so people understand, you're saying in your studies, and I heard you talk about this with Andrew Huberman on his podcast, that there was no direct connection, correlation, or causation between people who had higher expectancy that this would work and it working versus people who had lower expectancy and it working less. That wasn't the case?
That wasn't the case. And the dominant picture in our trial was that directionally those with lower expectations, which is common in depression, as you can imagine,
hopelessness.
Had their expectations exceeded by what actually happened. And let's just reflect on this.
And what about people with higher expectations?
I mean, the direction was such that they would numerically, if anything, do less well. The dominant picture is that there was no relationship between expectation, the variance in expectation, and how they actually responded. But there was directionally, if there was any kind of relationship, it was in the opposite direction to what we're used to, where, put it this way, lower expectations, people doing better. We're used to higher expectations, people doing better. but with psilocybin, lower expectations, people are doing better.
That's
with the
SSRI,
SSRI,
that's so fascinating.
Isn't it
That's incredible.
It's surprising, and then actually maybe that makes sense. These are also compounds, they'll produce the most meaningful and unusual experience of your life, but they also do something to expectation. We said we'd go to the rebus model, relaxed beliefs under psychedelics. Basically, that model I came up with the help of Carl Friston, a famous British neuroscientist. And the idea is that psychedelics relax our assumptions, and expectations are assumptions. So you coming in thinking one thing, you can feel pretty confident in a sense, in an ironic sense, that those assumptions are going to just be shattered. Assumptions about who you are, assumptions about who you are, say professionally or relationally. I mean, people forget who they are relationally under psychedelics. A colleague of mine, a psychiatrist, I certainly won't name his name, I was with at a music festival once. You could question what was going on here, but high dose of magic mushrooms, and he forgot he was a doctor. He started to believe he was a patient and got confused about it. So, thankfully I was with him and I could look after him. But that kind of tickled me, because, there's something about being a doctor that is often associated with pride, self-pride. And here's my friend who thought he was actually a patient. I thought it was a fascinating example of ego dissolution under psychedelics. Yeah. And then, and then the commitment to change in psychotherapy is another component that's likely there with psychedelic therapy. Another, peer of mine, someone I very much respect, Scott Aronson, who's been a kind of mentor to Matt Johnson, actually, in recent times. He studies mood disorders and bipolar disorder, and he's done some fantastic work with psilocybin therapy for bipolar 2. So, presentation of depression and these hypomanic episodes where people kind of get too high. Treating the depression there, he found 80% remission, I think it was, or response or remission.
For people with depression or bipolar?
Well, they had bipolar 2, and it was a remission from their depression. So they come in presenting with depression. I have heard it's easier to knock people with bipolar 2 out of a depressive episode. You would hope not into a hypomanic episode.
Yeah.
He didn't report that happened, but he knocked 80%, which is remarkably good response rate. I think it was actually remission rate. It was stunningly good.
Wow.
In our trials, we tend to hover around 70% response rate.
Yeah.
Which is very good. It's about 40% with SSRIs, 40, 50 maybe. So that's another reason why there's reason to be optimistic and excited about psychedelic therapy. We talked about that holistic action. Yes, by sheer efficacy. You could also go to side effects, different side effects. There are things that you could consider risks and side effects.
Yeah.
Trip really hard. There's the impaired judgment, so you've got to be looked after, headaches the next day. But with SSRIs, you get the cumulative side effects, through drugging yourself every day. I mean, those are harsh terms, but it's also literal. I mean, you're taking a drug every day for often many weeks, months, years.
Numbing yourself from reality.
Sexually as well, sexual dysfunction, their inability to orgasm, and so on.
I've had people on the podcast, a good friend of mine, Kim Woodsack, who's been talking about SSRI risks. Also, increased in suicidal ideation is not really talked about with SSRIs, and
it's a controversial one. It's there, but in younger people, there's a question mark over whether actually there could even be a increase in suicidality. It's one of the reasons it's on the label as a potential risk. So there's enough evidence for it to get on the label.
By the way, just a quick question. Did you move around your mic a little bit a second ago? Or
Oh, I'm sorry, I did. It's back, yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah, that's why you were still hearable, just 10% different.
Okay,
I just want to quickly say,
right.
I want to ask you in a second about how you started the brain imaging work and what was the motivation and thought behind it. But I just want to say one thing about what you said about expectations. I have direct experience of this. My very first psychedelic therapy session on MDMA in December of 2021, I had very high hopes. I read Michael Pollan's book. And actually, there's some interesting things that I really want to talk to you about default mode network. Although you found that for psilocybin, not MDMAs. But nonetheless, I had some thoughts about it that I've sort of changed my mind, or just have a maybe deeper understanding, or maybe just think very differently about it than I did before. But going into that trip, I had very high hopes and sort of more spiritual hopes. Sort of, I graduated high school in 2019. 2020 became a journalist, started writing, and just fell into a pretty deep sort of depression, somewhat exacerbated by pandemic, but just a number of things of just a very lonely, isolated period after high school. And I became very depressed and didn't really know who I was, my identity, cut ties with a lot of old people from high school, and kind of finding a new identity, finding a new self, finding a new meaning in life. Sort of post high school was very difficult. And so I read Michael Pollan's book, was watching documentaries and podcasts. And so, and also got very interested in Eastern mysticism and meditation and Buddhism, things like that. And so I went into the MDMA session with a lot of high hopes of sort of being liberated from this pain, transcending the pain, rising above it, if that's how you want to define transcend, rising above the pain, being liberated on some front from the suffering, detaching from the suffering, just kind of the idea behind transcendence. That's how people think of it, right? But the trip, and I sort of went through a very difficult heartbreak, this relationship issue before with this one girl who I was madly in love with, as can happen. And I went in wanting to work on that particular acute issue, and broadly speaking, achieve some kind of spiritual transcendence, which some people attest to with like a 5-MeO DMT or a high dose psilocybin or DMT, ayahuasca. People can have the sort of spiritual enlightenment experience. But the MDMA, I took it, and within an hour, straight back to childhood. I did not expect it at all. And the trip ended up being a big deep dive into my childhood, and particularly my relationship to my mom, and seeing her suffer, immigrant parents, trying to make ends meet, financial issues, and just a bunch of things from childhood that I hadn't really processed. And the trip was basically entirely about childhood and parenting and relationship to my mom and things like that. And so I came away from the trip like, that's not what I thought would happen. I thought this was going to be some more spiritual, transcendent kind of experience, or even sort of working on some issues in my present reality, as I alluded to. But it just took me back to a place that I never thought I would go to. I hadn't thought about childhood, and since really childhood, I just wasn't thinking about that at all in the last few years. Even after starting therapy a little bit, just childhood didn't really come up. And so I went into that. And similarly with future psychedelic trips, you kind of have these high hopes at times, but it's not that the hopes, it's just not what you think is going to happen. And it's as the quote says, psychedelics give you what you need, not what you want. And so you can want something, but so in some way it's like your hopes are let down in that you might not transcend your suffering in your first few trips or whatever, but it takes you to a place of deep pain or trauma or adverse experience, or something that needs processing, needs to be worked on, needs to be integrated into your life. Psychedelics take you to that place. And so in that way, it's sort of exceeding your hopes, because you might not have ever thought about going to that place. And clearly the fact that psychedelics can facilitate you going to those painful pinpoints in the past that you hadn't processed, that were impacting your present moment, as I found out, that's in some way that exceeds your expectations, because you would have never otherwise processed those things because they're too painful. And that's the utility with PTSD research, right? Is people have a hard time processing certain difficult things, and so psychedelics can help facilitate working through some very extremely painful things.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Rav. Yeah, I mean, you've just described something that Stan Grof would call the inner healing intelligence, the seemingly this inner healing, intrinsically healing action that you came in wanting one thing perhaps, but the action of the drug, let's say, the change in the brain, led you in an altogether unexpected direction, but probably after the fact a direction that was good and right and taught you something really helpful and beneficial. So it does leave us kind of in awe about this thing, like, what is that? It's almost, you said you kind of hope for a mystical experience, but there's something sort of mystical, spiritual, or at least, wondrous in that there was this like heat-seeking, love bomb or something that took you to a different place, and it was hard. It was sort of tough love in a sense, hard, but it was healing. And isn't that a fascinating thing? Some people wonder if that's projection, if we're romanticizing things maybe after the fact to make sense of it. Or others think that it's magic, or think that it's sort of metaphysically transcendent. It's something of like the hidden hand of God or something. I don't know. It does bring up ideas around teleology, like a kind of intrinsic directionality to things. It's fascinating. And I know in this call we've kind of critiqued the biological perspective, and I think that's good and healthy. But we've also said that we've qualified that by saying it's not biology, it's biopsychosocial. What is this in the healing mechanism? It may well be biopsychosocial. We've been describing in a sense what it feels like when it seems to happen that way. You've described that beautifully. And what would it be biologically? I do wonder whether there's something, that we could get into the weeds here, so I'll try and be careful. I think there's something of regeneration, of recovery to this phenomenon. Again, the theme of renaissance, rebirth, getting a second chance, something like a factory default reset. You went back to childhood. Childhood, as William Wordsworth would say, is when we're closest to God. We're born into the world somewhat like a blank slate, not entirely, we know, but closer to that than at least when we become an adult. And so is there something of going back to reset, recalibrate, so that it's easier to go forwards? I think we could explain that phenomenon, describe that phenomenon in a biopsychosocial, maybe biopsychosocial, spiritual way, actually. Yeah.